Hi everyone. Today I'm going to go over 10.5. I didn't record this session the other day, so I'm just going to go over it again with you all for those who couldn't make the Zoom meeting. And I'm going to go a bit faster because you're able to pause it. So if you find that I'm going too fast for you to take notes, just go ahead and pause the YouTube video. So it'll be a little bit faster than we're used to because it's not live. But we'll get started with 10.5. So for 10.5, the title is Evolutionary Biology Today. And the key concept is that new technology is furthering our understanding of evolution. So in this picture, it shows you red blood cells, and this is HIV. It's a virus. So viruses contain DNA or RNA, and they can mutate. The flu virus always changes. So every year there are new strains of flu. And that's why if you get the flu, you're immune to that one virus. So you won't ever get that virus strain again. But the flu can change into new forms, and that new form can infect you. And so that's why even a flu shot every year won't keep you from getting the flu, because that flu shot will immunize you against that strain. Most flu shots have about 3 strains that they immunize you with. And so those 3 strains you won't get sick from. But the flu can change form, and there could be a new form that's not in the vaccine that you could get sick from. HIV is a virus that changes very quickly, and there's no vaccine for it because of how many strains there are and how many times it mutates. And so that's why it's so hard to cure HIV. But this would be one example of evolution that we can use in a different branch of biology. So evolution is used in medicine in this sense. You're looking to see how viruses mutate, how do they change, what vaccines could be effective against viruses, how would your body defend against it. So we're going to look today at how scientists think about evolution, evidence for it. And again, when we say the word evidence, evidence means that it points towards something, but it doesn't mean that it's a fact. There can be evidence that somebody committed a crime, but it doesn't mean they're guilty. They can be found not guilty. So evidence can be misleading. It can point to certain things being true, but it doesn't mean that that actually is the truth. For example, the sun goes across the sky. Well, it appears to anyway. We think the sun is moving because it seems like it is. So there's evidence the sun moves because with our senses we can see the sun goes across the sky. But that's not reality. We know that the sun doesn't move. It's the earth that moves around the sun. So evidence isn't always what it seems. It's open to interpretation, especially with fossils. With fossils, there's a lot of guesswork. And most of the time when they get a fossil, it's not the complete animal. There's only part of the animal that's preserved. Maybe a jawbone, maybe a tooth, and that's it. And from that tooth, from that jawbone, they had to piece together the entire animal or what they think the animal might have looked like. So it's very rare to get a preserved body of an animal. They're usually dealing with small parts. And because of that, fossils are misleading. There are many times when they found a fossil that they think is a certain kind of animal that later on it's found not to be an animal. One time they found a pig's tooth and they thought that was a human's tooth. And from that one pig's tooth, they drew a whole human body of what they assumed that that man would have looked like. But later on they realized that it was not a human tooth at all. It was actually a tooth of a pig. So there are many times when a small fossil can be extrapolated and thought to be something that's really not. So paleontology is the study of fossils or extinct organisms. So this is looking at fossils of already extinct animals. Paleontology can provide evidence for evolution because we do see some animals changing over time in the fossil record. And so one example is this. This land animal, Pachycetus, is thought to have lived on the earth 52 million years ago. This animal was had a whale-shaped skull, though. So even though it was a land animal, it had a skull that was shaped like a whale, and its primary diet was fish. But it had hooves for feet, so it was not meant to live in the water. About 2 million years later after that, Ambulocetus natans, you can see that the body's changing, and it's going from a land animal to a water animal. This is more of a crocodile body shape. And so this spent more time in the water. The name Ambulocetus natans means the walking whale that swims. So it was kind of a clumsy animal, again, similar to a crocodile. It didn't move very fast on land. It was better adapted to live in the water. It was an amphibian, so it went between land and water. It ate mostly fish. And then about 10 million years after that, Durodon, you can see that it lost its hind legs almost completely, that the remnants of the legs are very small. Its neck also became shorter. So you can see that its body is more whale-like, but its joints were resembling ungulates. An ungulate is a hoofed animal, like a bison, hippopotamus. So any hoofed animal is an ungulate. And it seems like that this is related to those hoofed animals. So this is a transition, possibly, between a land animal and a sea animal, between a hoofed animal and a whale. And the thought is that possibly this is a whale's ancestor. Now, whether that's the case or not, we can't be certain about, but there does seem to be some evidence that these animals did change, and that it's certainly possible that this animal did change that way, in which case it points to evolution in the sense of change within the animal species. Now, when Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, his main concern was about the lack of fossils, the lack of transitional fossils between organisms. And so that'd be like we saw on the last slide, the transition between a land animal and a water animal. So Darwin expected to see in the fossil record a lot of transitions between different, very, very different animal species, between, say, birds and mammals, between fish and land animals. He expected to see animals changing from one to another in many transitions in between those very large changes. But he didn't see that. And he wrote in his book that the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory is the lack of fossils that show links between animal species. It seems like that for most of the fossils, animals don't change a whole lot. Certainly there are sometimes, like the last slide showed you, we do see some examples of animal change. But for the most part, they pretty much just stay as they are. We don't see these gradual changes over many years into other animal species. We really don't see many examples of, again, say birds turning into reptiles or a mammal turning into a water animal. It's not very often that we see that in the fossil record. And Darwin acknowledged this and said that this was a huge obstacle to his theory. But he did believe that in time that they would find those missing links, that the fossils would be found, and it would help vindicate his theory. So today, about 200 years after Darwin published his book, most paleontologists believe that the fossil record is complete, which means they believe they found most of the fossils that they're going to find, that there isn't going to be much more that they haven't already found in the fossil record. So really, for the most part, fossils are not great evidence for evolution. There are a handful of transitional forms that you can find that do show links between various species, but there aren't very many clear links between species. And so still to this day, it's the weakest evidence for evolution. So there are things that scientists look at besides fossils to help support the idea of animal change over time. Molecular and genetic evidence support the fossil and anatomical evidence. So the belief is that two closely related organisms will have similar DNA sequences because animals inherit traits from their parents through DNA. And so if over time animals change and adapt and they pass on those traits to their children, that's going to be through DNA. So by looking at the DNA sequences of different animals and comparing them, you could assume that the more similar DNA sequences there are between animals, the more related they should be. Just like in a family, among siblings, the DNA is more closely related than outside the family. Identical twins have the same DNA, and there's no differences at all between their DNA. So the more related you are, the more matches you're going to find between the nucleotides in the DNA. So looking at the DNA of various animals, scientists try to construct a tree of inheritance and try to find out what ancestor animals had before they diverged and became different species. So if you look at hippopotamus's DNA, this is a very small segment. There are millions and millions of nucleotides, if not billions of nucleotides in each animal. So we're looking at a very small percentage. But looking at a small fragment of DNA and comparing it, in this case, hippopotamus versus humpback whale, what we can see is that there are a lot of matches. No, T and C don't match, but we can see after that, most of these nucleotides are exactly the same. There's G and C aren't the same. But outside of a couple of nucleotides, we do see that it's almost an exact match. And so this does support the idea that hippos and whales are related, as we saw with the fossil evidence earlier. That also supports the idea that hoofed animals became whales. So if you have fossil evidence and DNA evidence, you have a greater certainty that this might have happened. Scientists look also at what are called pseudogenes. Now, pseudo means fake. And so pseudogenes are genes that don't work any longer. So there are genes that are still passed on to children, but they don't do anything. They don't make any proteins. So these pseudogenes are passed on along with the working genes to offspring. And these could be clues to a common ancestor. And so the idea is that there was one animal who had this gene that was then passed on to their offspring who also inherited this gene. Now the gene itself didn't do anything, so there was no reason for them to have it. And so because the animals didn't have any advantage in having this gene, there is some thought that this is evidence for evolution, because evidence for common ancestry, because there wouldn't be any reason for these animals to have this gene if it didn't do anything. They also look at what are called homeobox genes. Homeobox genes are genes that control the development of certain structures. And they're found in a wide range of organisms. You can see on here, a human and a fruit fly have similar homeobox genes. So the colors correspond to certain areas of the body. You see that the red boxes on here, these genes represent, these boxes represent genes that make the thorax of the fruit fly, the neck part of a human. The purple genes on here code for the thorax and the wings of the fruit fly, and they code for also the neck area of the human. And this is found in many organisms, again, very diverse organisms. And so because these genes are found in a wide range of animals and organisms, it's also thought to be evidence of a common ancestor, the first organism to have this, which then passed it on to all of their offspring. They also look at our protein comparisons. And so protein comes from RNA. We learned this a couple weeks back, that DNA makes RNA and RNA makes protein. So by looking at protein between different animals, what you're really looking at is the DNA. You're comparing the DNA between the animals. It's another way to compare the DNA. And we know DNA is passed on. And so again, the idea is to look at a lineage, to look at the history of animals and how genes are passed on through looking at the DNA sequences and the protein sequences. Molecular fingerprinting is comparing proteins between species. So cells from different species that had the same proteins might have come from a common ancestor. Again, the idea is that the DNA had the code to make the protein, and it was passed on through the DNA to the offspring. And the animals over time might have diverged into different species. So for example, the eye spots of the marine worm have light-sensitive cells with a molecular fingerprint similar to that of a vertebrate eye. So this worm has an eye spot. It's not really an eye. An eye spot doesn't see images. It really just sees light and dark areas. And the worm goes to the dark. So an eye spot does have cells, though, that do detect light, just like other eyes do. And they found certain proteins both in this animal, in the marine worm, and in vertebrates. So the vertebrate eye is a lot more complex. In a vertebrate eye, you can see images, but still there's the same protein or a similar protein found in both eyes. And so that is evidence that maybe there was a common ancestor that gave this protein to both the worm and the vertebrate animals. So that is one interpretation of this. It's not the only interpretation of this. We can think of it also this way, that when God made these animals, he gave them a blueprint. He found a blueprint that worked. And that blueprint was the body structure. It was proteins. And these working proteins and body structures, because they were a good design, he put in several different organisms. So we can interpret this in many different ways. One way, again, is to say that these must have come from one ancestor, which then passed them down and they diverged and formed different species. We could also think of it as evidence for a designer who, when he found a good blueprint, he just kept it. Evolution unites all fields of biology. Scientists from many fields contribute to the understanding of evolution, and the principles of evolution are used in many scientific fields. We talk about medicine especially. That's one of the important fields of evolution, because we can use that idea to predict how viruses will mutate. And based on our prediction of that, we can develop vaccines to help immunize us from those viruses. So that concludes section 10.5. We're going to review Friday and Monday, the test on Tuesday. And so the Zoom meeting for Friday and Monday at 9 will just be working the chapter review questions and having time to ask your classmates or me for help on those questions and to review for the test on Tuesday. I'll see you tomorrow.